You don't become a monolithic empire like Disney without exploiting every possible creative asset at your disposal. And so since 2010, the Mouse House has committed itself to remaking its most popular animated films in live-action form. The results, unsurprisingly, have varied wildly, and from project to project, it's always tough to tell how the next one's going to turn out. But where some of the most iconic movies ever made are concerned, it isn't something that should be taken lightly. So let's dive in, as I'm Adam from What Culture, and here is our list of every live-action Disney movie remake ranked from worst to best. Number 23, Pinocchio. There's certainly no Disney remake more immediately depressing than Robert Zemeckis' Pinocchio. As perfect as Tom Hanks seems to play Geppetto on paper, he's given desperately little to do in this most charmless, agonizingly forgettable retelling. Despite attempts by Zemeckis to tug on the audience's heartstrings, this is an oddly emotionally inert take, taking away the edgier elements of the animated version while indulging in a VFX overload that ranges from vaguely neat to a legitimate eyesore. Beyond a few solid performances and a stirring musical score from the great Alan Silvestri, this is yet another late-period letdown from one of America's most innovative filmmakers. And it didn't further help that Guillermo del Toro's stop-motion animated reimagining of Pinocchio was released mere months after this, and soundly mopped the floor with it. Number 22, The Jungle Book, Mowgli's Story. 4 years after the release of 1994's original live-action The Jungle Book, Disney curled out this direct-to-video quasi-prequel covering the younger life of Mowgli. Evidently intended to appeal to younger audiences, Mowgli's Story is a goofier romp that never gets out of neutral. The performances are fine and the practical animal training genuinely impressive, yet it's ultimately harmless to the point of dullness. Despite the impressively stacked animal voice cast, Eartha Kitt as Bagheera and Clancy Brown as Akela are especially inspired choices. This is sheer forgettable white noise for the most part. Exactly what's expected from a direct-to-video 90s live-action Disney movie then. Number 21, Alice Through the Looking Glass. A textbook case of a sequel that just took way too long to come out, the 6 years later Alice Through the Looking Glass is a whole lot of very expensive hot air and not much else. Sure, its visuals periodically dazzle and Sacha Baron Cohen is clearly having a damn hoot as the villainous Time, but the convoluted time travel-centric story is more irritating than fun. And at close to 2 hours in length, it's a bit of a slog to sit through. Fascinatingly, even the most casual of audiences rejected it upon release, as it grossed under $300 million globally, less than 1/3 of what its predecessor pulled in. As such, any prospect of a threequel was promptly squashed, and given the utter nothing burger that this sequel was, despite talented director James Bobbin taking the reins from Tim Burton, it's probably just as well. Number 20, Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. Hands up those who recall a single thing about this sequel dumped into cinemas in late 2019, and believe it or not, grossed almost $500 million worldwide. If the original Maleficent was already a relatively middling proposition, Mistress of Evil is basically a more of the same follow-up that strains to invest the audience in a second go-around. Angelina Jolie is great again, of course, and Michelle Pfeiffer is a fun addition to the cast as the villainous Queen Ingrid. But beyond this and the appealing visuals, it's a purely going-through-the-motions sequel. If someone told you this thing was written a weekend before shooting started, you'd believe it, because it's desperately lacking in creativity and even basic inspiration. Number 19, Lady and the Tramp. Though certainly not the most offensive Disney remake, it's telling that almost nobody brings up Charlie Bean's Lady and the Tramp even barely 3 years after it first hit Disney+. It's fine. Tessa Thompson and Justin Theroux are charming enough in the title roles, and it gets points for using real dogs, but the digitally superimposed mouth movements looks janky as hell, to be kind. Overall, this is a competent yet completely unremarkable film that struggles to shake the cheap whiff of it being a Disney Plus original. It doesn't look premium quality and more or less simply settles for being good enough. It doesn't commit any egregious sins though, which keeps it comfortably away from last place. Number 18, 102 Dalmatians. After 101 Dalmatians grossed more than $300 million globally in 1996, it was only inevitable that Disney would be back for more. And in the very least, this hilariously unimaginatively titled 102 Dalmatians brings Glenn Close back for another stab at Cruella de Vil. A typical law of diminishing returns sequel, 102 Dalmatians is more or less the same movie again. So in the very least, it benefits from Glenn Close's go-for-broke performance and some killer costume design. But basically, everything is operating at a far more familiar, less entertaining register than the first time around, ensuring it failed to light the same spark with audiences, grossing barely half of what its predecessor did. Number 17. The Lion King. Expectations were certainly high for 2019's The Lion King, given director Jon Favreau's prior success translating The Jungle Book into live action. Though The Lion King is absolutely pretty enough, touts solid voice acting, and leaves the classic story mostly untouched, it's ultimately far less than the sum of its parts. The decision to adapt the expressive and not remotely realistic original animation into a considerably more grounded piece of visual storytelling, one that basically resembles a National Geographic documentary, robs The Lion King of much of its style and personality. There's a fundamental disconnect between the ultra-realistic animal renders and their humanoid manner of speaking, ensuring Simba and company end up tumbling straight into the uncanny valley. You know what nobody needed from The Lion King? Realism. Given that it grossed over $1.6 billion worldwide though, Disney probably wasn't fussed about the resounding mediocre reviews. Number 16. Alice in Wonderland. Once upon a time, a Tim Burton-fronted Alice in Wonderland movie would have seemed like a pure creative slam dunk. But coming at the beginning of his career's paycheck era, it felt like an anonymous filmmaker offering up their best Burton impression. Though it's clear that an ungodly amount of money was spent on realizing Wonderland, the plasticky VFX lend the entire movie an uncanny in a bad way vibe that's tough to shake. A few worthwhile performances, especially Helena Bonham Carter as the hammy Red Queen, keep it firmly out of disaster territory, but the attempt to reimagine Alice as an action heroine comes off as cynical and unconvincing. Plus, Alice's billion-dollar success is basically what convinced Disney to make an industry out of these live-action remakes in the first place, so it's tough not to resent it at least a little for that. Number 15. Aladdin. Guy Ritchie was a maddeningly strange choice to direct the new Aladdin, all the more so given how little of his filmmaking personality is allowed to shine through. This is an identikit blockbuster production which skates considerably on the charm of Will Smith's entertaining take on the genie, which sensibly doesn't try to imitate Robin Williams, and the eminent appeal of Naomi Scott's Jasmine. Otherwise, it's basically a bland, mechanical redo rife with runtime elongating exposition and a thoroughly rubbish take on Jafar. No offense, Marwan Kanzari. Without Smith's show-stealing work, this one will be much tougher to stomach, but as it stands, it's simply a film that came out, existed in our collective minds for a minute, and then quickly evaporated. Number 14. Maleficent. Another nobody asked for this offshoot of a classic Disney animation, Maleficent presented a relatively unpersuasive origin story for Sleeping Beauty's mistress of all evil. But at least Maleficent has a fully engaged Angelina Jolie in the title role, giving all of herself over to the part, which in conjunction with some neato costumes and striking production designs ensures this is plenty nice to look at. Imelda Staunton, Juno Temple, and Leslie Manville are all also good fun in their all-too-brief roles as the Pixie Fairies, but as a piece of storytelling intended to get audiences thinking differently about its protagonist, Maleficent is less convincing. Remember when Disney villains could just be unsympathetic trash? What a glorious time. Number 13. The Little Mermaid. And now we come to the most recent remake on this list, Rob Marshall's The Little Mermaid. First and foremost, Halle Bailey and Melissa McCarthy crush it as Ariel and Ursula respectively, and it largely nails the classic songs. but this bloated 135-minute remake too often feels like it's merely going through the motions. Between the hugely underwhelming visuals, iffy animal designs, and brutal pacing, it's tough to enthusiastically recommend this when the original is sitting right there, and basically is better in every way, and almost an entire hour shorter. It's far from a disaster or an embarrassment, but The Little Mermaid lacks the inspiration and creativity to really justify existing beyond business reasons. Number 12. The Sorcerer's Apprentice. The Sorcerer's Apprentice often gets lost among the murk of the near 24 Disney remakes because, well, nobody bothered to watch it when it hit screens in 2010. The term remake is used rather liberally here, of course, given that Jon Turteltaub's fantasy adventure film is effectively a loose expansion of the Mickey Mouse segment from Fantasia. But the appeal of casting Nicolas Cage to play a sorcerer skulking around modern-day Manhattan in pursuit of Merlin's successor speaks for itself, and it delivers modest returns on that promise. Cage is, unsurprisingly, electric and bounces well off Bar Rochelle, while the $150 million production totes more appealing creative visual pyrotechnics than most of the films on this list. Narratively, The Sorcerer's Apprentice is doing little fresh or original, but it at least has a real sense of charm and personality, which carries it a long way. Number 11. Mulan. Mulan is a soundly middle-tier effort, which while offering some welcome thematic updates for modern tastes, it never really raises above mere decency. Ify Liu acquits herself well as the lead, and it's packed with creative fight choreography, though the editing is messily chaotic and intrusive VFX often lurch into eyesore territory, enough to make you question precisely where all of that $200 million budget went. It certainly wasn't on the original's beloved Eddie Murphy-voiced dragon Mushu, who was head-scratchingly removed from the remake altogether to appease Chinese audiences. Mulan was a solidly acceptable remake that caused offense to few fans of the original, despite settling for a relatively unambitious treatment. Number 10. Dumbo. Tim Burton's Dumbo gets the most important thing right, rendering its adorable title character in terms that are believable amid a slew of human characters, but still inherently fantastical. Though Burton was forced to sanitize the edges down for modern audiences, namely not having Dumbo get drunk during the pink elephant sequence, he holds little back when depicting the abuse suffered by the circus animals. This threatens to clash tonally with the goofier performances from the likes of Danny DeVito and Michael Keaton, but the film's decision to venture far past the end of the animation and give Dumbo's story a more satisfying, emotional ending somewhat helps even it out. The script feels a draft or two away from greatness, and the aggressively green screen production often sticks out like a sore thumb, but its heart is nevertheless in the right place. Number 9. Beauty and the Beast. 2017's Beauty and the Beast is dripping with competence but severely lacking on the inspiration front. Sure, it's an impressively mounted production with a strong cast that mostly does justice to its killer songs, but it rarely feels like more than just a longer, more bloated iteration of the Best Picture nominated original. It at least feels like a ton of effort went into both the aesthetics and performances though, save perhaps for Emma Watson's disappointingly auto-tune heavy vocals. Shout out elsewhere though to Luke Evans for giving such a persuasive flesh and blood performance as the insufferable Gaston. Beauty and the Beast is a prime example of a remake that dazzles while you're watching it and leaves you feeling not mad at the end, even if it fades away from memory so fast. Number 8. 101 Dalmatians. Attempting a live-action adaptation of 101 Dalmatians felt positively ballsy in 1996, given both the rudimentary state of VFX at the time and Disney's ultimate decision to shoot the movie with 300 real Dalmatian puppies instead. While the lack of talking dogs robs the pups of much of their personality, this adaptation is all about Glenn Close, whose scenery-devouring performance as Cruella de Vil rightfully nabbed her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress. Close's performance remains one of the all-time best live-action renditions of a character originated in animation, enough that even the eventual divergence into Home Alone-inspired slapstick violence, courtesy of writer John Hughes, can't derail it. It's not a great movie, but it does rock one hell of a killer central performance. Number 7. Peter Pan and Wendy. David Lowery's second stab at a Disney remake after Pete's Dragon may not have been particularly essential given the sheer number of live-action Peter Pan adjacent movies we've had over the years. But Peter Pan and Wendy nevertheless totes the soul lacking in so many of these remakes. Energized by lush visuals, a talented ensemble cast, especially a killer Jude Law as Captain Hook, and a narrative that makes some interesting deviations from its animated predecessor, this in the very least feels like it earns its existence. Not a great movie by any means, but if you look past the predictably vocal online hang-ringing, it's a solid effort that feels it at least came from a place of creativity rather than commercial obligation. Number 6. Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. More than 2 decades before Jon Favreau's live-action The Jungle Book, director Stephen Sommers gave audiences their first taste of Disney animation brought to life. Now, to be fair, Sommers' film can only scarcely be called a remake at all. It feels less a retelling than a continuation of the animated film's story, focusing on an older Mowgli, played with conviction by Jason Scott Lee, as he defends the jungle from evil colonizers. It's clear that this take on The Jungle Book borrows a lot from both Tarzan and Indiana Jones, functioning best as a broad adventure yarn than a slavish translation of Rudyard Kipling's text. Despite the lack of talking animals, it's fun seeing the likes of Cary Elwes, Lena Headey, Sam Neill, and John Cleese playing around in this sandbox. Number 5. Cruella. When a prequel/reboot to 101 Dalmatians was first announced, even many Disney fans rolled their eyes, because did the world really need an origin story for Cruella de Vil? While the answer remains a resounding no, director Craig Gillespie at least milks every last drop of style from this glitzy mid-brow crime comedy. Emma Stone is well cast as the younger Cruella, and Emma Thompson crushes it as the villainous Baroness, though it's ultimately Jenny Bevan's eye-popping Oscar-winning costume which leaves the deepest impression of all. As a piece of storytelling, it's far too awash in prequel cliches and groan-worthy plot twists, but in the very least feels like a real movie rather than corporate slop created to appease shareholders. Number 4. Christopher Robin. Disney remakes don't get much weirder than Christopher Robin, which follows an older, less hopeful Christopher as he once again crosses paths with Pooh. Though its more washed-out colour palette and bleaker tone didn't endear it to audiences en masse, Mark Foster's fantasy drama benefits enormously from its slighter, more restrained approach. First and foremost, Pooh looks wonderful, rendered here as a startlingly photorealistic living stuffed animal, voiced with customary soul by the great Jim Cummings. Ewan McGregor is meanwhile an inspired casting choice for Christopher, working from a script which eschews excess sentimentality in favour of something more restrained. It's nobody's favourite Disney remake, but it at least has a keen sense of artistry and intention behind it, beyond, lining the company's coffers. Number 3. Pete's Dragon. David Lowery's Pete's Dragon was soundly ignored upon its release in 2016, no matter that it's on the higher end of Disney's remake output to date. The script, co-written by Lowery, smartly removes the musical elements from the 1977 original, in order to place a far more intimate focus on the central bond between a young boy and his pet dragon. This is also the only Disney remake to be substantially shorter than its inspiration. With a whole 25 minutes of screen time cleaved away, it's all the better for it. The more low-key, even minimalist storytelling and modestly staged VFX, produced on a $65 million budget, ensured this failed to lure in mainstream audiences. But it's so much more personal and deeply felt than the majority of the films on this list. Plus, Robert Redford's in it, which is always a plus. Number 2. Cinderella. Trust Kenneth Branagh of all people to understand the essence of translating Cinderella to the live-action medium. Led by a perfectly cast Lily James in the title role and a delectable Cate Blanchett as the vile wicked stepmother, this is a superior remake which splits the difference shrewdly between faithfully adapting the source and building upon it. While even the better live-action Disney remakes are guilty of bloating themselves out, Cinderella's extended runtime, clocking in a half-hour longer than the animation, is well spent fleshing out its central characters and their motivations. Extraordinary production design and glorious Oscar-nominated costumes sure don't hurt either, and while Cinderella isn't as loudly discussed as other high-profile Disney remakes, it's one that more could stand to take cues from. Number 1. The Jungle Book. And finally, right at the top of the pack is the uncontested winner, Jon Favreau's sublimely gorgeous and heartfelt The Jungle Book. It's the only film on this list which can genuinely lay claim to improving upon its animated inspiration in almost every way. Despite taking the massive risk of shooting practically the entire movie against digital backdrops, there's an impressive seamlessness to Favreau's production which ensures there's never a disconnect between the human Mowgli and his digital animal companions. Plus, it's got Bill Murray as Baloo, and in an especially inspired casting choice, Christopher Walken as a terrifying mob boss interpretation of King Louie. So what's not to love? If so many of the live-action remakes have felt like cynical exercises in brand reinforcement, 2016's The Jungle Book is a pure opposite, in turn building a template which all subsequent remakes should have followed. And there we have it, folks, our ranking of every live-action Disney movie remake. But please do let us know down in the comments which one is your absolute favourite out of this list. And while you're there, make sure you give us a like and a cheeky subscribe. If you want to follow me on socials, I am at Strawn87 on Twitter and on Instagram. Come and say hello to me on there. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and until next time, take care.